Over the last few days, I've been testing and comparing Kinefinity's TERRA 4K and MAVO cameras, and in this video I'm gonna share with you some insights I gained. But first, let me show you some footage. Everything was shot with a Canon 2470 2.8 L series using all three kinds of Kinefinity CF mount adapters. In case you're wondering why I've used a shutter angle of 358 degrees with some shots here, well, it was the only way of getting more light into the camera without increasing the ISO, since I was already at the maximum aperture of my lens. Comparing both cameras, aside from the obvious difference in sensor sizes, which influences the crop factor, maximum frame rates, resolutions, etc., I found that the TERRA seems to have a higher native sensitivity than the MAVO. With the exact same settings on both cameras, the image on the TERRA always turned out a little brighter, so we always had to close the lens several stops lower than with the MAVO. I also found the image of the MAVO has much more depth, especially in the shadows, whereas the TERRA 4K has a flatter image. Here on the left, in the MAVO's image, you can see the shadows have much more contrast to them than the image of the TERRA here on the right. Same here with the shots of the leaves from below. This being said, both cameras are capable of producing great images, and it's actually really easy, as long as you stay within a certain range of exposure. As soon as you get to the edges of their capability in terms of dynamic range, you really need to know certain principles of these cameras. I found that the main thing to avoid is to underexpose the image, especially in the higher ISOs. If you do that, you'll get a grainy image, like this one. In order to expose your image correctly on these cameras, you need to understand the function called ISO highlight stops. This basically enables you to shift your dynamic range up or down in order to give you a better performance either in the dark end or in the bright end of the camera's dynamic range. Now have a look at this little setup, especially on the light bulb there in the back. I put an ND8 filter in front of it so we have a chance to see the wires inside the bulb. And if you look closely, you see that at first the area behind the light bulb is not clipped. We start at highlight 5.6, which is the maximum for TERRA 4K used in this test. Now once we reduce the highlight stop value, you'll notice that the bright area behind the light bulb will slowly clip out, which means that you lose all information in the clipped area. Here, have a look at the scopes, it will show more clearly what's happening. You see how the highlights are literally shaved off? This is because if you take our graph again, at the outstart of the test, the highlights of the light bulb were right about here. And as we lower the highlight stop, we will suddenly end up here, which then lies beyond the dynamic range. I found that the highlight stop function directly affects only the highlights. We don't gain anything in the shadows, but it does affect the lowest ISO value that you can choose. So for example with the MAVO at highlight stop 3.6, the lowest ISO is 250. And if we set the highlight stop to 6.6, the minimum ISO is ramped up to 2000. Now that we understand the highlights, let's have a look at the shadows. Here I found that while ISO does of course make your image more or less noisy, the main factor determining how usable that footage will be is defined by the exposure of your image. I was surprised to get pretty usable footage at 6400 ISO in one setup and terrible unusable footage in others, even with lower ISOs. Let's take this image for example. The ISO was set to 800, yet the image is very grainy in the darker areas. This has two reasons. One is the lower resolution of this particular high-speed shot, which makes the noise pixels proportionally bigger to the total image size, and the other is simply that the image was underexposed. I chose this example because in order to get everything right for this particular shot, you'll need to use pretty much the entire dynamic range of the camera. Now the amount of light I can let into the camera is limited by this stone wall here with direct sunlight hitting it. I exposed this shot just below the 99% zebra clipping point, and if you look at our scopes here, you will see the same shaved off highlights as we saw before with the light bulb example. This is because in this shot we were at highlight 4.3. If we had taken the same shot at highlight stop 5.6, we could have exposed the total image a little more without clipping the highlights, giving us more light in the darker areas and just allowing for a less noisy image. Now, coulda, shoulda, woulda will not convince you, so I went out and tested this for myself. A little soccer place nearby showed similar characteristics, direct sunlight coming through the surrounding trees and some darker areas behind the fence around the field. Highlight stop was set to 5.6, ISO to 1000, and here's the result. While the highlights are mostly unclipped, the background is bright enough so that the noise at ISO 1000 is even less visible than the one before at only ISO 800. To conclude our comparison, while the TERRA 4K does have slightly better low light performance, the MAVO's stunning 6K footage downgraded to 4K will always allow for a sharper, much cleaner image. The TERRA's smaller sensor allows for higher maximum frames per second, but for that, the MAVO's Super 35 sized sensor offers a better crop factor. The dynamic range of the MAVO is very impressive by any standard, but so is the TERRA 4K's low price point. It's a tough one. Let me know in the comments which one you would rather have or not, and why.